Tonight's story unfolds slowly. You won't hear battles or speeches, but if you listen closely, you'll meet the women who shaped thought. Not with books, but with silence. They were never called philosophers, and yet they taught in the way that endures. Through presence, through stillness, through lives too deep to record. Over the next hour, you'll walk alongside them. You'll serve tea, remain uninvited, listen without reply, and begin to understand how wisdom survives in quiet. This is not history retold. This is philosophy remembered. Now let the world soften. Let your breath grow slower. And step with me into the rooms the scrolls forgot, but the soul still remembers. You are not here to be impressed. You are here to be quiet, to be still. The words that mattered most in history were not shouted from marble steps or carved into temple stone. They were spoken in kitchens and courtyards, shared between gestures, and passed from hand to hand like warm bread. You will not find them in scrolls. But if you slow down, if you allow the noise to settle, you may begin to hear them. Tonight, we drift not through the loud halls of empire, but into smaller rooms. Spaces where the voices were softer, yet the thought was no less sharp. Where women, unseen by scribes, shape the texture of understanding through rhythm, through patience, through presence. This is not a story of rebellion. It is a story of enduring influence, of lives that asked no permission, of teachings that moved like water, impossible to grasp, yet shaping everything they touched. Let the weight of your body drop gently into the surface beneath you. Breathe in. Let silence gather in your chest like a thought just beginning. Now walk with me. You do not speak first. In this house, words come slowly. If at all, the teacher has arrived before dawn. His sandals are dusty, his eyes lined with the discipline of travel. Your brother bows, says little, disappears into the side room. It is you who must bring the tea. The clay cup is warm in your hand. You hold it steady as you approach. He does not look up when you set it down, but he nods. A nod that is neither approval nor dismissal, just awareness. You feel seen, and then unseen again, just as quickly. There is no cushion offered to you, no seat prepared. You remain standing. You think of leaving, but your feet do not move. Not yet. The teacher clears his throat, not from discomfort, from ritual. A signal, your brother re-enters with a scroll, but it is not opened. Not yet. First, there is stillness, not two voices, two air. The garden outside breathes against the lattice. A fig leaf trembles. You notice the crack in the cup you held. Small hairline running like a river through fired earth. It feels like something you've seen before in yourself. He begins to speak. Not loudly, not clearly. His voice is more like gravel than music. Words land like stones dropped in a pond. You don't know their meaning, but something in the rhythm enters you. He says, a thought worth remembering should feel like forgetting something untrue. Your brother nods. You feel it too, though you don't fully understand why. You move back to the edge of the room. Sit near the wall. No one asks you to stay. No one tells you to leave. You stay. The lesson is not for you, but you are learning. Each time he speaks, your eyes catch the gesture of his hand. Slow, deliberate, like drawing shapes that never settle. Each time he pauses, your chest fills with something like longing, not for words, for whatever exists behind them. Your mother used to say, a wise woman does not speak unless the silence asks her to. You remember now. The floor is cold beneath you, but you do not move. The sound of your brother's quill scratching down notes is the only interruption. You watch how the teacher allows questions, but rarely answers them. How sometimes his silence feels heavier than his thoughts. A part of you wants to interrupt, to say something, anything. But what would it serve? The truth does not arrive through force. It comes when it is ready. Later, when the lesson ends and your brother walks him to the gate, the teacher turns once more to look at you. Just once. You do not smile. You do not bow. But in that brief moment, you know he knows. You had learned more than your brother. And yet, you said nothing. Because nothing needed saying. Later, your brother asks if you understood what was said. You shrugged. You don't answer the question. Because it wasn't a question. Not really. You understood something, but not in the shape of words. Not yet. It lives in you more like a shadow or a scent. That night, you lay awake longer than usual. The house is quiet. The clay walls hold the warmth from earlier, but your body feels strangely cool. Not uncomfortable. Alert. You replay the lesson in your mind, not to remember it, but to feel again the way time stretched and folded in on itself while the teacher spoke. You think about his hands, the rhythm of his speech, the pauses more than the content. You do not know the names of the books he quoted. You do not know the rules of debate or the shapes of but something passed to you. You're sure of that. And it passed in the way of all real knowledge, quietly, uninvited, and permanent. In the morning, you go to sweep the floor. Your mother is baking, her sleeves rolled, hair tied, hands coated in a mixture of flour and certainty. She doesn't ask what was taught. She doesn't need to. She says, "Don't forget to clean the corners." That's where things settle. You realize she's not talking about the floor. You clean carefully. You find yourself remembering how the teacher traced invisible shapes in the air. You begin copying them with your fingers. Not to imitate, but to understand the motion. Thought, you realize, isn't something you sit down and do. It's something you practice, like carrying water without spilling it, like listening to a conversation with no words. That evening, you watch your brother study. He is focused, diligent, disciplined. He recites lines under his breath. He builds memory like a wall. You don't interrupt. But you wonder, what if wisdom isn't what's stored, but what's absorbed? What if it isn't a fortress, but a fragrance? Your thoughts don't come in complete form. They drift. They repeat. They circle the same point slowly, like birds waiting to land. You sit nearby, holding a piece of thread. You begin to twist it, coil it, unwind it again. Your fingers move in patterns you don't plan. You don't know it yet, but this too is study. The next week, the teacher returns. This time, he sees you already seated in the corner. He doesn't react. He does not acknowledge your presence, but he doesn't ignore it either. When he speaks, his voice is slightly slower. He allows more silence, and when your brother stumbles on a concept, something about motion and cause, the teacher asks, "What do you think?" But he isn't looking at your brother. He's looking just past him. At you. You do not answer, but your breath deepens, and he nods. That is enough. From that day, you remain in the lessons. You still do not speak, but sometimes the teacher glances toward you when making a point. Sometimes your brother waits, just a little, before answering, as if to give you time to think. You are not a student. You are not enrolled. You have no scrolls or ink or duties, but every day the learning grows. And not just in the words, in the way you sit, in the way you notice what no one else does, in the way you begin to feel when a sentence holds weight, even before it ends. One morning, as you sweep the courtyard alone, you hear a pair of travelers discussing the school. They say the master teaches only men. One says, "Yes," says the other. But sometimes, the walls learn too. You hide your smile. You return to sweeping, and with each stroke of the broom, You feel the dust carry something away and leave something else behind. There are days when the lessons blur. The teacher speaks of ethics, of desire, of how the soul leans toward clarity like a plant bending toward light. You do not remember every argument, but you remember the temperature of the room, the sharp smell of ink, the way your brother's posture shifts slightly when he begins to grasp an idea. You do not write, but you trace thoughts across your lap with your thumb, invisible in private. One day, your brother grows frustrated. He says the ideas contradict, that virtue cannot be taught, and yet must be lived, that the teacher is dodging questions, that truth is being cloaked in riddles. You do not answer him, but you watch the teacher's expression as your brother protests, calm/unshaken, almost amused. After the lesson, you ask your mother, why does he never argue? She says, because truth is like a still pond. Only the unready try to stir it. Weeks pass. You begin to predict which ideas will return. The teacher repeats things not because he forgets, but because truth deepens when heard again in a different silence. You feel your understanding grow not in steps, but in shadows. Not like building something, but like slowly learning the shape of a room by walking through it with your eyes closed. One morning, as you pour tea, you feel the weight of the cup shift slightly in your hand. Not dangerously, but deliberately. You let it tilt, just enough. The teacher catches it calmly, and your fingers graze. He says nothing, but his glance is full. Later, your brother asks if you spilled. You say no. But you think of the moment often, the unspoken test, the gentleness of contact, the wordless exchange. That evening, a visitor arrives, a scholar from another city, full of long words and louder presence. He praises the school but questions the inclusion of listeners who do not speak. You are nearby, gathering bowls, pretending not to hear, but the teacher says, sometimes the best mind in the room is the one not competing for it. The visitor laughs awkwardly. Your brother avoids your eyes, but the teacher continues his lesson, unfazed. And you sit a little straighter. You begin to realize something subtle. Philosophy is not about answers. It is about the posture of attention, the willingness to remain present through discomfort, the courage to carry a thought to its softest edge. You practice this now in everything. When your sister complains of chores, you do not correct her. You listen. When your mother sighs at night, you do not offer comfort. You offer presence. When your brother struggles to remember a passage, you do not prompt him. You wait, and in waiting, you teach. You dream of a world where women write scrolls too, where learning is not something you must overhear, but something you shape. But you do not chase this dream. You let it walk beside you, quietly. You know that some teachings arrive through lineage, others through accident, but the deepest ones arrive through silence. And so you remain, listening, absorbing. And one day, when a younger girl brings tea to your brother, and stays near the door a little longer than needed, you do not call her away. You let her stay, and you say nothing, because wisdom, once given silently, knows how to recognize itself. The mornings always began before the sun lifted its head over the tiled roofs. The light came slowly, seeping through the cracks in the shutters like hesitant understanding. In the courtyard, stone held the night's chill a little longer than necessary, as if reminding every foot that stepped across it that comfort was earned, not assumed. The olive tree near the threshold had long stopped producing, but no one cut it down. It stood as it always had, crooked, watching, enduring, much like the ideas that filled this house. When the lessons began, there was no signal, no bell, no raised voice. The teacher would enter slowly, take his seat, and begin to speak as though continuing a thought that never truly ended, only slept. The room would shift, not in volume, but in texture. The air became denser, breaths shortened, even the flies quieted. Every word moved with the weight of something older than the one who said it. No ink could match it, no argument could hurry it along. Your brother always sat straightest in those hours, but he rarely interrupted anymore. Something in him had softened, or perhaps sharpened inward. You noticed how the lines between student and thinker had begun to blur, and in that blurring, the rhythm of the day found its hum. The teacher spoke not to teach, but to remember aloud. He traced not the boundaries of knowledge, but the spaces between certainties. His voice had become less an instruction than a current, and everyone in the room had learned to float, not swim. There were pauses, long ones, not because he had forgotten what came next, but because he respected the space around a thought as much as the thought itself. Sometimes he would simply stop and stare out at the cracked courtyard tiles, his lips barely moving, as if chewing the silence before offering it back. You understood now. These moments were not absences. They were teachings. The sun would rise unnoticed, casting long shadows across the woven mats and broken clay, but no one adjusted. The warmth entered slowly, and like the lessons, it belonged to no one. Even the birds near the roof stopped calling once the discussion deepened. You watched, day after day, how the atmosphere itself became a philosophy. There was no rush, no urgency. Even disagreement was quiet, like a soft pull against fabric, not a tear. When someone challenged an idea, the teacher did not defend it. He held it in the air, turned it slightly, and offered it back with a different angle. Not to defeat the question, but to let it live longer. There were moments when the lesson would dissolve entirely into quiet. The teacher might close his eyes, the students might look inward. Sometimes, a fire crackling in the side hearth would become the loudest sound in the room. And no one would speak, because everyone understood. The deepest thoughts are those that require no words. You notice how presence became its own discipline. One learned to sit without twitching, to listen without response, to breathe without disturbing. Your own stillness improved. At first, you simply tried not to be noticed. Then, you tried to absorb. Now, you had begun to reflect. Not aloud, never aloud, but within. Even outside the formal sessions, the atmosphere lingered. In the courtyard, conversations happened in glances. In the kitchen, the way your mother added spices was measured, philosophical. In the garden, silence grew between the leaves. Nothing was wasted. Every motion carried the residue of thought. Every gesture bore the echo of something larger than itself. One evening, the teacher remained after the others had left. He stood beside the olive tree, his hand resting lightly on its bark. You stood nearby, not speaking. He turned to you and said, "You see how it bears nothing now, yet still gives shade?" You nodded. Some teachings are like that, not useful, not fruitful, but still necessary. He did not wait for a response. He walked away. You remained, and the meaning unfolded within you, not like a revelation, but like dusk. Slowly, evenly, completely. You began to recognize the philosophy not in speech, but in the pauses between speech. Not in definitions, but in habits. You noticed how the teacher's sandals were always placed in the same spot near the doorway, not by command, but by quiet ritual. How the scrolls, even when unused, were aligned with reverence. How the students breathed differently when the lesson deepened. More slowly, less urgently, as if afraid to stir the air with conclusions. There were no lists of axioms, no proud declarations. And yet, the weight of inquiry was always present, like the scent of oil in the cracks of old wood. Subtle, unshakable, embedded. When questions were asked, they were seldom answered directly. One student once asked, "What is the nature of the soul?" And the teacher responded by closing his eyes and reciting a short verse about wind and water, then saying nothing more for the remainder of the hour. The student did not repeat his question. He had already received more than he expected. You came to realize that understanding here was not acquired, but allowed. Not grasped, but permitted to settle. Each truth entered slowly, like the way firelight gradually fills a cold room. Not by spark, but by presence. One morning, when the discussion turned to the ethics of restraint, no one spoke for nearly an hour, and no one left. The teacher simply sat, watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. Until at last he whispered, "To restrain is to give shape to what would otherwise be wasted." That sentence lived in the room for days afterward. It was quoted in the kitchen. It was murmured during chores. Even your brother began repeating it, not out of memorization, but out of need. Outside the school, the city continued its noise. Markets opened. Merchants shouted. Children laughed too loudly. But inside these walls, everything moved at the speed of comprehension, and nothing else mattered. There was a softness to it all. Even disagreement had no heat. The teacher once offered two contradictory statements on the same day, and no one corrected him, because they understood now that truth wasn't always consistency. Sometimes it was breadth. Sometimes contradiction was not a flaw, but a mirror. You found yourself moving differently through the house, setting things down more gently, choosing silence over correction, holding a thought longer before sharing it. And though you still did not speak during lessons, the teacher's gaze began to land on you more often. Not for permission, for confirmation. As if he knew that your silence was not empty. It was full of echoes, of patience, of invisible growth. One afternoon, after the others had gone, he left a scroll near the wall where you sat. He did not say it was for you, but no one else picked it up. You took it home that evening, held it in your lap for hours before unrolling it. The ink was faded, the letters tight, unfamiliar. But it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the gesture, the offering, the unspoken acknowledgement that learning does not always require permission, only readiness. You didn't tell your brother. Some knowledge is too private to share, even with those who mean well. Instead, you began rising earlier, preparing the room before anyone arrived, sweeping, placing cushions, lighting oil with hands that had learned to move with intention. No one asked you to, but the atmosphere of thought had settled into your bones. And you knew now, teaching is not always a matter of words. Sometimes, it's how you prepare a space. Sometimes, it's how you sit without needing to be heard. Sometimes, it's simply how you remain. One day, the teacher arrives and says nothing for a long time. The students shift uneasily, glancing toward the door, wondering whether the lesson has begun or been silently canceled. But you stay still. You've come to recognize this pattern. The delay is not absence, it's invitation. Finally, he speaks. There are truths which only grow in the soil of waiting. No elaboration, just that. He closes his eyes and breathes deeply, as if listening to something older than memory. A leaf falls outside the window and lands soundlessly on the stone. You don't need more. From that moment, the lessons begin to change. Not in topic, but in tone. The students grow quieter. They ask fewer questions. The teacher stops completing his thoughts. He begins stories, but ends them mid-phrase, letting silence carry the rest. A girl once stood by the olive tree, he says, and nothing more. But everyone understands what he meant, or rather, they accept not knowing. Your brother comments one evening that the class has grown frustrating. We used to learn ideas, he says. Now it's all gestures and air. You nod, but inwardly, you feel something else. a quiet certainty. Because now you see it clearly. The atmosphere is the teaching. The unsaid carries more weight than the spoken. The teacher has shifted from instruction to transmission, not through facts, but through presence. And those still enough to receive it begin to change. You begin noticing patterns in the everyday, how certain words feel heavier at certain times of day, how silence after a hard question feels not empty, but full of potential. You see how wisdom doesn't sit in the content of speech, but in the space around it. Your mother offers a cup of broth one evening and simply says, "Warm enough." You answer with your eyes. She nods, nothing more. It is a conversation, complete and intact, without a single unnecessary syllable. And so your life becomes quiet, but not hollow. You sweep more slowly. You prepare meals with thought. You place things in patterns that calm the room. When your brother loses his temper at a guest, you do not scold him. You place a folded cloth near his hand and look once, long enough for him to remember the atmosphere he once cherished. He softens. Nothing is spoken about it later, but the gesture lingers, like breath in cool air. Weeks later, the teacher pauses he looks around and says, "There is someone in this room who has not spoken once, yet has said more than any of you." Your brother straightens, uncertain. The other students glance at one another, but the teacher is already walking away. You remain seated, hands folded in your lap, face still. You feel nothing dramatic, no pride, no recognition, just a calm, internal motion. Like a door slowly opening in a house you didn't know had a third floor. And from that day forward, the atmosphere itself begins to change in your presence. People lower their voices around you. Questions are phrased more softly. Even arguments feel like they pass through a filter. You have become the silence that teaches, the stillness that shapes the shape of things. And when you meet the eyes of younger girls entering the house with trays of bread or ink, you nod. Not to greet, but to assure you are seen. You are already part of this. Your place in the room is no longer questioned. It's no longer peripheral. Yet still, you do not sit at the center. You never ask to lead, and no one appoints you. But something has shifted. A rhythm has formed around your silence, a soft orbit of attention. Even the teacher now pauses slightly before he speaks, as if checking whether the room is aligned, and that often means checking whether you are ready. It is not about authority, it is about gravity. One morning, as you enter before the others, you notice that someone has placed a second cushion where you usually sit, not to change your position, but to acknowledge it. The gesture is quiet, anonymous, full of meaning. You do not touch the cushion, but you sit beside it. A kind of agreement forms between you and the space, a recognition that presence can be honored without needing to be rearranged. That same day, the lesson is about virtue. The teacher says, virtue is not a position of the body or a claim of the tongue. It is how one alters the weather of a room by simply entering. Your breath slows. The words settle into you like dust on a windowsill. Undramatic, but inevitable. Later in the courtyard, you watch as a younger student struggles with a passage. She mutters to herself, frustrated. She's not used to stillness, not used to being unsure. You walk past her, slow and silent. You do not correct her, but you pause just long enough that she looks up. Your eyes meet. You nod once. She exhales and returns to the text. You've given her no answer, but you've given her room. And room, you've learned, is the first condition of wisdom. Your brother, now older and busier, comes to fewer lessons. He begins taking visitors, speaking with greater authority. Sometimes, he repeats the teacher's phrases, but with a sharpness they never had. He quotes silence, but never enacts it. You do not judge him. but you feel the divergence. Not all who study the shape of truth are shaped by it. The teacher notices too. One day, as the lesson ends, he walks past your brother without acknowledgement, then turns to you and says, "Do you know what makes the olive tree sacred?" You shake your head. It survives fire, but never complains. It offers oil without boasting. And when it grows crooked, it does not ask to be straightened. He does not explain further. He does not need to. By now, even the walls of the house seem to know you. Your movements match their age. Your silences match their cracks. You no longer feel the need to listen for meaning. Meaning arrives on its own, like light does when shutters are drawn back. Not suddenly, but completely. And so your role is never declared, but always felt. You are a student, but not in the usual sense. You are a listener, but more than passive. You are a presence. The kind that allows thought to take root. The kind that teaches others how to hold questions like lanterns, without extinguishing their flame in the rush for answers. And when the teacher eventually grows ill, and the lessons grow fewer, you are the one who stays. You do not nurse him. You do not recite his teachings back to him. You simply sit nearby, letting the atmosphere remain intact, letting the final lessons unfold wordlessly, like dusk settling across a familiar courtyard. Because you understand now more deeply than ever, that some teachings can only be learned by being near what does not need to be said. There is no doorway marked for you, no invitation sealed with your name. The knowledge you seek does not come in open arms. It comes in narrow alleys, in overheard fragments, in glances held too long, in questions you are not supposed to ask. The school is near, but it was never meant for you. Not for your hands, not for your voice, not for the shape of your life as the world draws it. And still, you want it. You want it in the way roots want water. Silently, stubbornly, beneath the surface. At first, the hunger feels like guilt. You clean the room before lessons, but linger too long by the doorway. You carry the tea and listen harder than is proper. You find yourself repeating phrases under your breath while scrubbing pots or mending cloth. Your hands move through tasks, but your mind loops around ideas you were never meant to hold. You begin to feel torn in two. The daughter who does as she must, and the mind that drifts toward forbidden clarity. You hear it in the way your mother sighs when your questions grow too sharp. You feel it in the way your brother grows cautious. When you speak of the lesson's meaning instead of its method, you listen too well, he says. One evening, but the words land like a boundary. And you know, to be harmless, you must not appear to understand too much. So you hide it. Not by pretending ignorance, but by disguising attention as grace. You keep your eyes low, but your mind open. You nod where others speak. You fold your learning into gestures, placing cups gently, clearing scrolls with care, repeating the teacher's phrases in the rhythm of your daily work, never aloud, always inward. Your learning becomes folded into silence, and still it grows. There are moments when shame rises, not because you are wrong, but because the world has convinced you that knowing too much makes you less of what you are supposed to be. When a guest asks your brother, "Does she learn anything at all?" and he answers, "She's good at listening," you feel the bitterness in your throat, not because it's false, but because it's true, and only part of the truth. Listening has made you more than they see. One night, you lie awake tracing letters on your blanket, recalling the argument the teacher posed earlier. Whether justice is innate or trained, you are meant to sleep. But your mind refuses stillness. It burns gently, constantly. You rise and light a lamp. You write your first sentence in secret, not for the world to read, not even to preserve, only to exist in the act. It feels like trespassing, and also like a rival. The next day, you say nothing. You serve as usual. You sweep the dust. You fetch the scrolls, but your body carries something new. A tension, a flicker, not rebellion. Resolve. You've tasted something permanent, and now you carry it with you, like breath. In the following weeks, the teacher begins to slow down. Not from age, but from a shifting rhythm. He speaks in shorter bursts. He waits longer after questions. He begins to refer to the idea of unseen knowledge, wisdom that lives in things not spoken, not recorded. Not every mind sits on the mat, he says one morning. Some listen from behind the wall, and those are often the ones who listen best. He doesn't look at you when he says it. He doesn't need to. And slowly, your shame begins to rot away, not vanish, decay. You no longer fight the customs. You learn to move through them, like water moves through stone. You do not argue for your right to study. You study. You do not ask to be taught. You learn. You make peace with the invisibility, because you've discovered something deeper than permission, presence. And in that presence, a quiet, unshakable kind of power begins to root itself in you. You begin to see that what you once thought was exclusion was, in fact, a form of training. Not in the structured way your brother learned, with scrolls and lectures and notes, but in the deeper discipline of attention without recognition. Your thoughts became sharper precisely because no one expected them to form. Your understanding deepened because no one interrupted it to define it. You learned how to listen through walls, how to piece together meaning from tone, from gesture, from absence. What felt like denial had become refinement. And yet, the world around you still moved with the same rules. When visitors arrived, you were expected to lower your gaze, to move silently through the background like air with hands. But now, every movement you made carried weight. You were no longer invisible to yourself. You walked not to be seen, but with full awareness that you existed beyond the roles offered to you. The tension between who you were and what you were allowed to show remained, but it no longer controlled you. Sometimes, as you listened to the teacher's lessons, you would silently test the arguments yourself. You would disagree. You would construct counterpoints in your mind. Arguments shaped from experience, from rhythm, from watching how people changed in silence. You knew things your brother did not. Not about history or terminology, but about consequence, about when to speak, and when to let the weight of a moment do the speaking. And in this unspoken practice, you began to feel yourself become something new. Not merely a learner, but a philosopher, without title, without scroll, without permission. You did not tell anyone. You did not need to. The way you looked at things had changed. That was enough. You no longer needed to ask whether you had the right to think. You thought, and the teacher knew. Of course he knew. In his questions, in his silences, in the way his gaze sometimes lingered just long enough before turning to another. One day, while discussing the nature of memory, he said, "Some knowledge cannot be passed in ink. It must be born. Like a child carried silently, not shown until it breathes on its own." No one responded, but you felt your chest grow warmer. Later that day, you found a small strip of parchment folded between two cups. There were no names, just a single line. "She who speaks without words does not speak less." You hid it beneath your blanket. You never showed it to anyone, but you read it again and again until the ink began to fade and you no longer needed to. Your hunger had not vanished. It had matured. It no longer gnawed. It guided. It moved you toward books left unattended, toward scholars too distracted to notice your language, toward rituals of thought you now practiced alone. Your solitude was no longer a cage. It had become a sanctum. And in that sanctuary, you began to build a philosophy that was yours. Not stolen, not borrowed, not granted. Formed in silence, sharpened by absence. And still, no one spoke your name in the circle of learning. But the learning had already grown beyond the circle, and you had become its center. You start to notice that even the younger boys, sons of scholars, nephews of patrons, begin to glance at you differently. Not with admiration, not with suspicion, with recognition. They've seen you long enough now to know that your stillness is not servitude, that your silence is not passivity. When the teacher offers a riddle or a parable, a few of them instinctively look toward you. Not for the answer, but for the cue that the question is worth more than the words that came in. You never speak, but sometimes you meet their eyes, and that is enough. The old customs still linger. Women may tend to thought, but not dwell in it. They may repeat wisdom, but not originate it. But cracks are forming in the rules, and the light coming through looks familiar. You never asked for those cracks, but your presence has made them visible. You've become a quiet edge inside the tradition, not sharp enough to cut it, but enough to change its outline. One morning, while sweeping the edge of the courtyard, you overhear one student telling another, "I learn more watching her listen than I do from half the lectures." The other shrugs. "She's not allowed to teach." The first replies, "She doesn't have to." And you pause, just for a moment, before resuming the sweep. You smile, but it's inward, like a slow ember catching in dry wood. The shame that once curled in your stomach is gone, replaced by something steadier. Not pride. Something older, closer to belonging. You belong to the thought, not to the structure around it. You've made a life not within the rules, but beneath them. In the roots they didn't bother to notice. You've built meaning in the shade, and that meaning begins to show itself in how others behave. The girls who help in the kitchens now sit longer in the courtyard when lessons happen. The teacher doesn't shoo them. Sometimes, he even glances their way. The air has changed. Slightly, but unmistakably. And you are the reason. Not because you argued, not because you fought, but because you remained. Because you learned in a world that told you learning wasn't for you. And now, the world has begun, ever so slightly, to shift around your silence. You are still not quoted. You are not yet named. But the echo of your presence is louder than most voices. You are becoming what the scrolls forgot to mention. A philosopher with no parchment. A thinker with no claim. A teacher who never asked to teach. And that is perhaps the purest form of wisdom there is. She was not born in silence. She walked into it. Not as exile, but as choice. Hypatia of Alexandria, daughter of Theon, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, entered a world where thought was power. And power was a dangerous possession for any woman. Yet she did not flinch. Her life was not a rebellion. It was a practice, not loud, not theatrical, measured, composed. Her clarity was not a performance. It was a form of devotion. You hear her name whispered once by the teacher. Not emphasized, not explained. He mentions her as if she were a principle, not a person. As Hypatia taught, he says, purity of reason cannot exist without purity of life. No one asks who she was, but the air changes when he says it. You feel it, the same way you feel a shift in wind before a storm. Later, alone, you ask the kitchen girl, the one who once studied with a traveling healer, if she's heard the name. She nods, carefully. They say, she walked through Alexandria with her head uncovered, she says, not as defiance, as proof she had nothing to fear. You nod slowly. You do not speak, but the image lodges in you like a stone placed deliberately at the base of a wall. What you begin to understand is this. Hypatia lived as if the mind were the only robe worth wearing. Her body existed, yes, but her thought eclipsed it. She taught in the open, not in temples, but on the streets. not in shadows, but under sun. Her students were men of influence. Her enemies were men of fear. And both bowed, in different ways, before what she represented. She did not raise armies. She raised questions. She drew geometry in dust. She explained celestial patterns with hands as calm as sleep. And yet, her clarity shook those who mistook religion for ownership. In her refusal to belong to one camp or another, she became dangerous. Neutrality, in a fractured world, is often seen as betrayal. And so she was followed, watched, then finally punished, not by error, by design. Her death was not a tragedy of chaos. It was a choice made by men who feared her mind more than her voice. They could not defeat her argument, so they ended the body that carried it. But they failed, because what she embodied could not be buried. You picture her in your thoughts often now, not in the moment of her fall. That part you choose to blur. You picture her instead walking through the streets of Alexandria, scrolls under her arm, eyes unflinching, movements exact. You picture her explaining the movement of stars to boys too proud to ask questions, and girls too afraid to be seen, listening. You realize that she never expected to be safe. She expected to be clear. And that expectation of herself, of the world, of truth, is what made her luminous. She was not only a woman who thought, she was a woman who made thought visible. And in doing so, she paid the price that those ahead of their time are often asked to pay. Not because they are wrong, but because they reveal how wrong the time is. You hold this thought like a flame cupped in your hand, carefully, not to worship her, but to continue her. You begin to understand that Hypatia's story is not meant to shock. It is meant to stay, not as a warning, but as a rhythm. She teaches you something that no teacher ever says aloud. That philosophy is not protected by wisdom, but threatened by ignorance and power. That purity of mind, when lived too visibly, invites the kind of violence that does not argue. It erases, and yet the clarity remains. In the courtyard, one evening, you watch a student attempting to recite a formula. Something about proportions, spheres, the divine symmetry of motion. He stumbles. He grows impatient. The teacher, old now, says nothing. But you remember the story. How Hypatia once smoothed an equation with charcoal on the floor of the temple stairs, while a crowd pressed close, half skeptical, half reverent. She explained not with authority, but with ease, as if thought were not rare, just rarely welcomed. You whisper the formula to yourself, testing it. The student doesn't hear. But you see the shape settle in your mind, like a bird folding into a branch. Hypatia is still teaching. She does so in fragments now, in gestures, in your stillness, in your refusal to forget. When no one speaks of her, you carry her in how you carry yourself. When no one defends her, you do. Not in argument, but in the precision of your thought, the calmness of your gaze, the endurance of your presence. You walk the corridor slowly, as she did. You listen when others fight for attention. You wait for meaning to come on. You draw unseen lines between the stars, with your breath, and perhaps this is how she survives. Not in monuments, not in books that quote her as legend, but in women who never asked to be heroes, in learners who never asked to be taught, and those who do not interrupt, who do not flee, who do not explain, but remain. One afternoon, the teacher calls the lesson early. His voice is quiet. Weary, the students file out slowly. He sits alone under the fig tree. You bring him water, set it beside him, begin to walk away. But he says, "Do you know why? Hypatia taught under open sky." You pause. "Because stars cannot be contained," he says, "and neither can those who understand them." He says nothing else, and neither do you. but the thought wraps itself around your spine like armor. Not for protection, for memory. Hypatia is no longer a woman in a history you weren't invited to. She is part of you, not as an idol, as a standard. As proof that philosophy, when fully embodied, does not need permission to endure, she is not gone, she is not tragic, she is not exceptional, she is inevitable. And you, quiet, present, listening, are the next movement in her proof. They were not named in the scrolls, but they were there. Behind the men who debated in the beside the boys who memorized verses, inside the homes where philosophy was not recited. It was lived. These women did not ask to shape thought. They shaped it the way wind shapes stone. Slowly, consistently, without asking to be seen. You begin to notice them in the pauses of the stories. A Stoic who learned restraint from his mother, but never mentioned her name. An Epicurean who spoke of tranquility but never explained who taught him how to breathe through pain. They are there. In the unnamed hands that packed the bread, adjusted the robe, asked the question that changed the direction of an idea. Not loud, but indispensable. Your teacher once mentioned Aurelia, mother of Marcus Aurelius. Just once. He learned more from her presence than from any tutor, he said. And then moved on. But you didn't. You thought of what it meant to be the well from which calm was drawn, and never credited. What it meant to teach without curriculum, to shape without recognition, to discipline through example. In the evenings, when the lessons end and the courtyard cools, you watch the older women of the household move through the fading light. They do not speak of reason, but they move with reason. Every motion has intention. Every gesture has scale. There is no waste, no indulgence. When one of them lifts her gaze and says, "That's enough for today," it's not instruction, it's principle. You begin to understand that philosophy was never just in the academies. It was at the loom, in the shared meal, in the choice to hold a tongue or let it go. The Stoic mother does not quote Epictetus. She lives his teachings before they are even written. The Epicurean sister does not explain moderation. She simply practices joy without excess, care without attachment. And it clicks. Wisdom was not only passed down through words, it was passed in how a table was set, how a child was corrected with patience instead of scorn, how grief was worn without making it everyone else's burden. You remember your own mother's silences, her insistence on finishing work before speaking, her refusal to speak badly of anyone, even when wronged. You once thought it was duty. Now you see, it was discipline. One day, a younger girl in the kitchen spills oil. She panics. You kneel beside her and clean it in silence. When she looks at you with shame, you simply say, "It teaches us how to be careful." She nods, slowly. That's all. But the next day, she moves more mindfully. And you realize, this is how it happens. Thought becomes habit. Habit becomes presence. Presence becomes philosophy. There are no statues to these women, no records of their teachings. But their ideas live in bodhis, in routines, in unspoken standards. They taught sons how to listen before they spoke. They taught daughters how to stand without needing permission. They held the structure of thought together without asking for credit. Like mortars between stones, you do not need their names. You carry their method in stillness, in clarity, in restraint, in your choice to never stop learning, even when no one expects you to know. One afternoon, while sorting herbs in the outer room, you overhear two students debating the nature of something. One insists it is suppression. The other, refinement. Neither mentions the woman who taught them both to wait their turn to speak when they were children, nor the sister who made space for silence in every room she entered. You listen quietly, fingers separating time from mint, and realize that neither of them truly understands what they're trying to define. You think of the neighbor woman who speaks only when necessary, who wraps grief in bread and delivers it without explanation. You think of the aunt who faced the death of a son with the same tone she used when instructing a servant. You think of your grandmother, who never named her beliefs, yet lived each day as though the universe were listening. These women did not argue over ethics. They embodied them. The world names philosophers who carve their ideas into stone. But what of those who carve them into days, into meals, into gestures, into how they endure without spectacle? These women are not celebrated, but they are remembered, in the way warmth is remembered in winter. Not by declaration, but by contrast. You begin to model yourself after them more deliberately now. Not in what you say, but in how you wait. How you withhold reaction without erasing yourself. How you allow others to finish their thought, even when you know where it's going. How you choose not to correct every mistake. Because clarity often arrives through self-discovery, not interruption. One evening, as your brother returns from a city gathering, he tells you about a woman there who spoke plainly and well. They called her clever, he says, but not philosophical. You ask why. He shrugs. She spoke like she meant it, didn't quote anyone. And you feel the ache of generations in that sentence. The idea that quoting a man makes you serious, but speaking from truth makes you soft. You say nothing. You don't need to. Later that night, you sit beneath the open window. The moon is high, quiet, present. You write a single line on a scrap of parchment. She who lives the principle does not need to name it. You fold the parchment and slide it under your mat, not to preserve it, but to place it where you sleep, where ideas settle into the body. These women, these unnamed matriarchs of thought, did not lose history. They chose another form of permanence, not the kind that demands to be remembered, but the kind that changes how remembering works. They are there, in the foundation. They are the reason the walls stand, and now you are one of them. Still learning, still watching, still building a philosophy that speaks with your every movement, even when no one hears it spoken aloud. The rhythm of your life begins to echo theirs. Not in imitation, but in recognition. You start to understand that you are not discovering a new way of being. You are returning to one that was always there, buried beneath noise and names. When you fold linen, you fold it with care, not as a task, but as a practice in precision. When you pour tea, you no longer think of serving. You think of balance, of the weight of the vessel, of how the hand steadies itself when giving. They are reminders. And you notice that others notice. The girls in the kitchen watch you longer now. One begins to ask questions, not with her voice, but with the tilt of her head. Another lingers after the lessons, just to sweep where the dust has already been cleared. These are not signs of curiosity. They are signs of formation. They, too, are beginning to understand that wisdom doesn't require a platform, only presence. You begin to see how thought settles in a house. It settles in how one corrects a child without raising a voice, in how salt is added only after tasting, in how patience becomes the default response, not because one is weak, but because one is strong enough not to rush truth. These are the teachings, but they are what hold the visible world together. One morning, you are asked to bring scrolls to the teacher's chamber. He is tired. He speaks little. As you lay the parchment beside him, he watches your hands, then says, "It is not surprising that so many good men were raised by quiet women." He closes his eyes. The statement is not meant to flatter. It is a reflection, old and soft. You leave without responding, but you carry that sentence with you all day, letting it steep like leaves in warm water. Later in the quiet of the storeroom, You find a broken tablet tucked between jars. Someone has carved a single word into it, nearly worn away by time. Aquatest balance? Not equality as the world defines it, but inner balance. The kind that holds a room steady. You place it in your apron. You don't know who carved it, but you know what they meant. And in the days that follow, when disputes arise, when pride swells and the voices of boys eager to be heard, you remain still. You do not correct. You wait. And often, the tension breaks on its own. Wisdom, you have learned, is not what interrupts chaos. It is what makes chaos unnecessary. So when someone asks, weeks later, who taught you? You smile faintly. Not with irony, with reverence. Because the answer does not fit into a name. It is a lineage of motion, of restraint, of quiet consistency, of women who shaped thought without ever sitting at the table where it was discussed. And now, your every movement is an offering. Your every silence is a page. And your life, without fanfare, without inscription, is becoming a philosophy in full. The older women begin to acknowledge you more directly now. Not with compliments, never with praise, but with small shifts in how they move around you. They no longer speak over your silence. They no longer correct you when you pause before acting. When they enter a room and see you there, they pause a little longer before continuing with their task. Not deference, alignment. You've joined a rhythm too subtle for ceremony. And that's how you know you belong. One evening, a mother calls her daughter over while you're near. The girl has broken a plate. The mother does not scold. She kneels, picks up the pieces, and glances toward you. What do we do when something breaks? She asks the girl. The girl shrugs. The mother looks at you, not for help, but for presence. And you say gently, we make the space around it calm, so nothing else falls. The child nods. That is enough. The moment settles. Later, the mother touches your arm once as she passes and says nothing, but you feel it. The quiet confirmation that you've become part of a chain far older than doctrine. You think more often now about how philosophy survives. Not through bold declarations or public debates, but through the way one generation watches the next. Through gestures passed hand to hand. Through the instinct to observe before reacting. You begin to see that many of the women around you are philosophers, though no one has called them that. They've simply mastered the art of making their way through a world that rarely makes room for them, without becoming smaller themselves. Sometimes, at dusk, you walk alone to the edge of the property, to the low wall where the sea breeze can be felt if the day was hot. You stand there without thinking, without seeking, and in those moments, clarity comes, not in the form of answers, but in the absence of needing them. You realize that all along, what you've been learning is not a system of knowledge, but a state of being. A way to live with thought resting gently behind the eyes. One day, when a visitor speaks too loudly in the courtyard and mocks the slowness of the lessons, the teacher says only, "Some minds require volume to feel full." The visitor laughs. The students glance at one another. You simply continue arranging the mats. But inside, something settles further into place. You no longer seek to prove what you know. You no longer feel the ache of not being seen. Because the truth you carry isn't decorative. It's structural. You've stopped waiting for the world to name what you've become. It no longer matters. Because you already know. You are part of a quiet lineage. A philosophy not written, but lived. Not declared, but embodied. And each day, in every small choice, you continue it. No one has written your teachings, but they are already being learned. You begin to notice something else now. Something quieter than silence, subtler than restraint. It is continuity. The way one moment carries into the next without announcement. The way wisdom does not begin or end, but flows. You move through the house, through the garden, through the storeroom, not with caution, but with cadence. You're no longer observing philosophy. You are inside it. The girl who once spilled oil now walks with her head a little higher. The women in the kitchen speak to you not as a helper, but as one of their own. Not because of words exchanged, but because they recognize how you carry the invisible. That heavy, fragile thing that lives between thought and gesture. When the teacher's voice grows thinner with age, when his pauses stretch further, you are the one who completes the rhythm of the room. Not by speaking, but by holding the silence in place, the others have begun to look to you without realizing it. You can feel it in their shoulders, in how they sit straighter when you enter. You are still not declared a philosopher, but the way you listen changes the shape of the conversation. You notice how your restraint invites clarity, how your presence makes others more thoughtful, how the girls around you learn to measure their tone, not out of fear, but from watching how you refuse to rush. You've become a vessel, not of authority, but of memory, and you realize now. This was always the way. The stoic mother, the Epicurean sister, the unnamed aunt who taught through presence. They did not need scrolls. Their scroll was the rhythm of the household. Their ink was repetition. Their legacy was the atmosphere that made understanding possible. You are that now, for others. Not because you planned it, because you endured. One day, as the teacher finishes what may be his last public lesson, he says, "There are philosophies that shape the world, and others that keep it from falling apart." He does not look at you. But the silence after he speaks feels different. He nods, and the lesson ends. You remain seated long after the others leave. The sun is low, the air is soft. You hear a breeze catch in the fig leaves. The same sound it's made for years, unnoticed. But today, it sounds like continuation. And that's what you are now. Not a name, not a title. A continuation of what was never written, of what cannot be undone. A matron of reason, a keeper of breath, a silent teacher whose silence teaches everything that needs to be known. It began not with a cry, but with a pause. Not with banners or protests, but with women who, when asked to obey, stood still instead. Their silence was not compliance. It was refusal shaped like stillness. And in a world that measured worth by volume and obedience, that stillness was dangerous. In Rome, the public voice was a man's tool. Laws, debates, decrees. These were battles of the tongue. But beneath the marble in the forums, behind the walls of stone houses and shaded courtyards, another kind of speech was growing. One that needed no voice. Women who did not argue, but did not yield. Women who performed their roles while quietly altering the meaning of those roles from within. You think now of the way your own silences have multiplied. Once born of caution, now chosen with precision. You no longer stay quiet because you're forbidden. You stay quiet because you know your presence speaks louder than interruption. And so did they. The Roman matrons, the educated slaves who taught logic to senators' sons while remaining unnamed, the priestesses who withheld blessing until the city bent toward balance. They used silence as shape, as signal, as shield. Some women in Rome refused to remarry when their husbands died, not because they mourned, but because they refused to become property again. Some refused to weep during trials, not because they felt nothing, but because to cry would be to give the court what it expected. Some stopped speaking Latin altogether and returned to the languages of their mothers, whispering meaning in tongues the empire could not regulate. In every refusal to speak on command, a philosophy formed, one that said, "You may take the space around me, but not the rhythm inside me." These were not rebels. They were still, and that stillness disrupted the architecture of control. You've begun to feel this too. When visitors ask questions that disguise commands, you answer only with your eyes. When someone jokes that women have little to say in matters of thought, You let silence linger long enough to become uncomfortable. Not as protest, as demonstration. You are no longer asking for space. You are the space. And in this, you join those Roman women who shaped culture by choosing not to perform it. Who raised philosophers not by speaking, but by refusing to echo ignorance. Who knew that some truths cannot be argued into the world, only embodied until the world adjusts. They were not saints. They did not always win, but their existence bent power's edge, slowly, invisibly, like water does to stone. And now, in your every withheld word, in every moment you wait instead of answer, you become part of that lineage. A kind of invisible resistance that grows not by conquest, but by clarity. They cannot record what you are doing, but they will feel its shape. The power of silence, you begin to see, is not in what it hides, but in what it withholds. In Rome, a woman who remained quiet during a senator's feast was not unnoticed. She was studied because silence in the face of noise unsettles those who expect reflection, not resistance. When she does not flatter, does not laugh on cue, does not nod when expected, she shifts the balance. She reminds the powerful that agreement cannot be assumed. And even when they pretend not to see her restraint, their tone changes. You think of the stories whispered between women at the edge of rituals. Stories of grandmothers who healed with herbs and said nothing to the priests. Of wives who corrected their husbands' logic in bed, but let them speak unchallenged at the table. These were not women who asked for justice. They became the adjustment, not through confrontation, through presence that did not bend. One winter, a Roman matron refused to dress in mourning after her son was executed, not from coldness, but as refusal to let the state claim her grief. They could take his life, but they would not choreograph her sorrow, and her dry eyes said more than protest ever could. These acts were not loud enough to echo in history books, but they are carried quiet and intact, in gestures passed between women like invisible talismans. You know them now. The way a hand lingers on a shoulder before letting go. The way a gaze narrows when injustice is near, but words stay locked behind the teeth. The way you hold stillness when asked to rush and say no simply by continuing what you were already doing. And this is why silence is feared, not because it signals weakness, but because it cannot be manipulated. A voice can be twisted, a scream can be dismissed, but a long pause, that cannot be misunderstood. It exists beyond translation. It alters the room. You find yourself practicing this now. When you hear something false, you don't correct it. You hold the space until it collapses on its own. When someone underestimates you, you do not prove them wrong. You let the weight of their assumption fall between you like a stone dropped in still water. Loud at first, then gone. You are learning the Roman lesson. Silence is not absence. It is choice. And the choice to remain whole when the world wants you reduced is the beginning of every real philosophy. So you continue. Quietly, you prepare the room. You hold the gaze. You do not flinch when dismissed. You are not waiting to speak. You are allowing the silence to accumulate weight until it teaches something louder than words ever could. In time, you begin to recognize silence not as one act, but as many. There is the silence of dignity. When you choose not to defend yourself against smallness, there is the silence of strategy. When you delay your reaction, so that others must sit longer with what they've said. There is the silence of refusal. The quiet, immovable no that lives in your eyes, in your stillness, in your refusal to be hurried. And there is the silence of mourning. Not for loss, but for the parts of the world that remain blind to their own brutality. Roman women knew these silences. They carried them like tools. When law silenced them in the courts, they moved through the marketplace and shaped thought and price and gesture. When ritual excluded them from speech, they shaped mood with breath and rhythm. When philosophers cited one another, women became the space where those thoughts were tested. Not with arguments, but with consequence. The empire thought its voice ruled the world. But beneath that voice lived another current, carried by those who could not speak freely, yet shaped what freedom meant. In kitchens, in gardens, in childbirth, and in grief. In the long glance exchanged between two women when something unjust is said aloud. And both choose not to respond, not because they agree, but because the silence itself is a correction. You begin to collect these moments. You see them everywhere now, in how the old woman rearranges the fruit at the stall without comment, undoing the mess of a careless boy. And how a mother holds her child's face for a heartbeat too long when her husband walks away in anger. And how a girl draws a line in the dust with her toe during a lesson. Not speaking, but clearly thinking. These are not accidents. These are teachings. One afternoon, a visitor mocks the slow pace of the school. He calls it lethargy. If wisdom is real, he says, shouldn't it be urgent? The teacher does not respond. The others shift uncomfortably, but you simply continue folding cloth beside the wall, your hands steady, your face unreadable. And the visitor, sensing something he can't define, begins to speak more carefully, not because he was corrected, because the room would not carry his carelessness. That's the final lesson you learn in this lineage of silent women. That sometimes the most transformative act is not to push, not to break, not to confront, but to stay. To stay calm when provoked, to stay centered when excluded, to stay present when forgotten. Because permanence comes not from declaration, but from endurance. And endurance is what makes defiance holy. You've become, now, part of that quiet revolution. One foot in tradition, one in transformation. You are not its leader. You are not its hero. You are its proof. There are no lines to cross anymore. Only rooms you enter without asking, and roles you inhabit without name. You no longer wonder whether you are seen. You wonder who is watching silently now, the way you once watched. There is always someone. A girl sweeping a floor slower than needed. A young man who sits nearer to the wall each time you're present. An older woman who speaks less and listens longer. You see them all. And in them, you see the next movement of this slow revolution. Not built on speeches, but on shared stillness. One day, a scholar arrives from the capital. He speaks quickly, references books you've never read, uses phrases designed to impress. He talks of logic and structure and truth as if they are trophies to be won. You listen from the doorway as the others lean in, flattered by his confidence. When he finishes, silence follows, not reverence. Confusion. The room feels thinner, not fuller. And the teacher, now too frail to stand, says simply, truth does not arrive dressed for applause. You don't speak. But the scholar looks at you as he leaves, unsettled. Perhaps he recognized that something in this house would not yield to cleverness. That something wordless here held more weight than all his citations. And perhaps he sensed, though he could not say why, that it had something to do with you. In the weeks that follow, you become quieter still, not withdrawn, rooted. You don't move less. You move less in response. You act without reflex, and those around you begin to orbit that stillness, not because they're told to, but because something in them remembers that the deepest knowing does not raise its hand. When the teacher's time comes, there is no formal farewell, no final speech. He simply does not arrive one morning. The room is prepared, the scrolls are laid out, and the mat where he sat remains empty. The students wait. Some shift, some sigh, but you do not move. You understand. The final lesson is this. Endings are not always loud. After the others leave, you remain. You sweep the room as always. You light the lamp. You fold the empty mat with the same care you folded your first one years ago. And in that act, without pronouncement, without blessing, something passes. Not authority, not power, presence, continuity. The quiet, undeniable acknowledgement that the space he once held is now held differently. And when the next lesson begins, no one says you are teaching, but they all sit a little straighter when you enter. They all speak more slowly. And when a new student fumbles through a question, she looks toward you, not for the answer, but to see if the silence that follows is safe. And it is. You were never named in the scrolls, but neither were the roots of trees, and still they held everything upright. You were never invited to speak, but silence, when chosen, speaks more deeply than permission ever could. You did not call yourself a philosopher. You lived like one, not in public debates, but in how you arranged the world around you to be more bearable, more thoughtful, more human. The lineage you carry is invisible, but everywhere. It's in the way a woman pauses before answering, not from hesitation, but from consideration. It's in the way knowledge is folded into daily life, in how bread is broken, how grief is honored, how truth is protected from spectacle. You did not conquer the system, you did not destroy it. You endured it without becoming it. You walked through its halls and refused to echo its assumptions. You left its titles untouched, but emptied them of their meaning. You became the teacher the structure forgot to imagine, and could not unmake once you arrived. Now, others take their place around you, not in rows, but in rhythm. They listen differently, they move more slowly, they begin to ask questions with fewer words, and understand answers that come with none. And in this, you see it clearly. The legacy of women who taught without speaking is not a collection of ideas. It is a way of being, not to be remembered, to be repeated, so you continue, with no need to be noticed, no hunger for recognition. You are not seeking immortality. You are practicing philosophy in its oldest, truest form, still aware, unshakable. And as sleep draws near, you let this knowing settle into your breath. You rest in the quiet certainty that the most powerful ideas do not announce themselves. They endure. Just like you,